So we'll start recording. And so we're the Community United for Safety and Protection, and I'm also going to be screen sharing our slide presentation for everybody today. Thank you for your patience. And yeah, so Community United for Safety and Protection, we're current and former sex workers, sex trafficking victims, and our allies. I'm a current working prostitute of 30 plus years. Now I pretty much plan on working as a prostitute for another 30 plus more. Our group is going to be talking tonight about the 2024 legislative session here in Alaska. And Amber, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Amber. I'm the outreach coordinator here with CUSP. I'm also going to be kind of manning the chat and kind of letting people in. So if we do get like some kind of weird Zoom bombed, I will be like trying to get that taken care of. Worst case scenario, we'll have to go out and then come back in. So I'm a sex worker here in Alaska, and I've been one for about 20 years. About 10 years ago, actually 10 years ago, I was charged with sex trafficking in the second degree. And that was for being a sex worker and then working with other sex workers for our safety and our security. And you can see some of my social media links down there as well. And I'll give it over to Tara.
Hi, I'm Tara. Maxine, if you push that button up, that big button that says slideshow, it'll make it full screen. Up and over. Yep. No, over. No, over on the other side.
To the right.
Yeah, right there where it says slideshow. Yep. Yeah, I'm Tara Burns. I was a victim of sex trafficking here in Alaska as a minor, and I have also worked in the sex industry for a few decades now. And a few years ago, when they made the sex trafficking law back in 2013, I got really interested in what was going on and why we were not allowed in these conversations about us. And so I went to school. I went back to UAF and I got a master's degree. I did some research on the lived experiences and policy recommendations of people in Alaska's sex industry that was recreated at Brown University and then across the country. And I have been doing research and policy work around sex work issues ever since. I'm the research and policy director of Coyote, Rhode Island. And then, of course, I also work with CUSP here in Alaska. And I just started a Substack. I started it right before the legislative session. And you can see I was like going along and I was like, I'm doing this thing. And then the legislative session got crazy and I just dropped it. But I'm going to get back to it. And there is a mix of stuff on there about sex work policy, sex work research, and my life. But you can pick the categories that you want to subscribe to. And so, yeah, I travel all over the world and I talk about sex worker rights and policy and sex trafficking. But it always makes me nervous to show my face and talk about those things here in Alaska because, if my neighbors found out that I was a sex worker, bad things could happen to me. And men, like Brian Stephen Smith, are allowed to kill women like me. So I know for all of us who engage publicly, as part of our work with CUSP, it's always a little scary to show our faces and talk like this.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Tara. Let me see if I can make okay, there we go. I click the slide. Amber.
So yeah, hey, sex work and the force of law. So in the sex work industry, our working conditions, including sex trafficking, serial killing of sex workers, and other violence against us, are created by police and the politicians. So this is easily understood in Alaska history in the same way that workers within other industries organize and negotiate with bosses. We organize and we negotiate with our bosses, which is the police and the politicians. So legislators have the power to make criminals out of us. With a stroke of their pen and a few votes, they can make sex trafficking survivors register as sex offenders. They can take away police's right to have sex with us when they are arresting us. They can create the crime of felony prostitution. They can allow us to work together safely in houses, or they can allow us to call the police when we're victims without being arrested for sex trafficking ourselves. And they can also make laws like having us sign up as sex offenders if we are arrested for certain crimes.
You can just use your arrows on your keyboard. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, so yeah, so this year's legislative session was all about the Christian nationalist strategy. All the bills this year sought to create overbroad and bad definitions of everything. Commercial sexual exploitation, redefining pornography, redefining making prostitution a felony, redefining life, redefining, who a person is, redefining murder, redefining sex trafficking. So, the patriarchy is always concerned with the control of women's bodies and men's free sexual access to women, which sex workers resist because, we charge for it. The Christian nationalist agenda aims to promote patriarchy by forcing their values of controlling our bodies, women's bodies, on everyone through the criminal justice system. So this session, we saw that manifest in Juneau in a series of anti-trans, anti-sex work, anti-abortion bills, many of them sponsored by Rep. Sarah Vance of Homer, Alaska. This presentation is going to focus on the anti-sex work bills, and it's important to understand that these anti-sex worker laws in the context of the Christian nationalist attack on women and LGBT people's rights.
So you've probably noticed, you probably got here from the newsletter, and you've noticed that we send out alerts about bills when it's, time to call in and testify, or time to write letters or sign petitions. And if you want to follow all of these bad bills, you could join our email list and also Planned Parenthood's email lists, and they'll send out updates on the anti-abortion and anti-trans bills. So
did you skip one by chance? No? Okay, right here. No, right back one. Yeah, right. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about some anti-sex work bills here. The HB 254, Rep. Vance did this one. It was about censorship. HB 264, Rep. Vance did that one. It's also about the screening tool. 259 as well is about the Sex Trafficking Council. And then 67 and 68 were both governor bills, and that's a sex offender registration and then the felony prostitution. So we're going to be talking quite a bit about HB 66, which is Senator Matt Claman. He kind of put a bunch of different parts of different bills together for the omnibus crime bill. And completely separate than all of that, those are kind of the anti-sex work bills. There's a different one that we actually supported, and that was HB 265 from Rep. Sarah Vance. And that was just changing the wording for child pornography to sex abuse of a minor material.
So the first bill that we're going to talk about is House Bill 254, which was the censorship bill. So House Bill 254, if you go to the next one, Maxine, it would have created a really broad definition of pornography, so that a lot of the things that you see like on Twitter or just on the internet would have been defined as pornography. So you see it says here, pornography means material that, and then if we go down to B, it can be a description like literary erotica, or an actual simulated or animated display or depiction of pubic hair, anuses, vulvas, genitals, or nipples of a female breast. So for example, like a pencil drawing of a female breast would be defined as pornography under this bill, as well as things that, you know, actually are pornography. And then if we go to the next slide, House Bill 254 would have created civil liability if minors accessed our pornography. So for me as an adult content creator here in Alaska, you know, I sell my pornography only on OnlyFans and Fansly, which provide me with age verification services so that I know that minors are not able to buy my pornography. But people like men join and they will download all of my pictures, and I've found my stuff being sold by these guys that are pretending to be me on like Discord. So this bill would have made it so that I could be sued if a minor accessed my pornography, and also like just a lot of the promo pictures that we post, that people post on Twitter that are not pornography, like would be pornography. So this is part of the kind of war on sex workers and criminalization of sex workers. And then also, as we were calling in and testifying against this bill, it was literally like the day after the trial of Brian Stephen Smith wrapped up. So it was pretty emotional testifying, you know, about this ongoing war on sex workers while there's no laws. Legislators don't care that we're being killed or that men are allowed to just like take our pornography, steal it, and resell it. And then next slide, Maxine. There are also a lot of privacy concerns that I'll let Maxine talk about.
Yeah, so HB 254 raised a bunch of serious privacy for consumers. So, you know, that would be anybody, people, you know, who are looking at porn or buying porn. They would have to use age verification to be able to gain access to those sites. And the age verification systems are plagued with problems. Some of the age verification systems are hackable. So if you are using your face or your ID to upload to a third-party site to verify your age so you can gain access to the adult content, those can be hacked. You know, we saw a big healthcare provider in California, you know, got hacked this last year, you know, or 1+ million people's information, health information was exposed online. So we would expect that under these age verification systems. There's ways to get around the age verification systems, which are called VPNs, where you just go online and gain access to one of the free ones or a paid one, which will show that you're logging in from a country that doesn't require age verification, and then you can gain access to the adult content anyway. You know, if you're an LGBT person and you're just trying to make inquiries about basic, you know, sexuality type of questions, you know, and you have to use an age verification, you know, and it becomes public knowledge that, you know, you're trying to find out information about something of sexual conduct, you know, you could be discriminated against. You can be discriminated against in, you know, housing, or if you're in the middle of a child custody issue. So really what, you know, the people who are trying to say that they need children to be protected by providing these age verification systems is that really it's up to the parents. You know, the parents could easily use the parental controls on their devices to control what their underage people are looking at. And so we would like to incentivize that instead of you know, exposing a bunch of privacy concerns and cutting off a whole industry to, you know, a bunch of people and their livelihoods. So HB 254 did get through the House Labor Commerce. It got to the House Finance, went to the House floor. It went to the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee, and it was stopped in the Senate Finance Committee. And basically it was rubber stamped all the way through these committees. We wrote letters, we gave public testimony where we were able to in each of these committees. Some of these committees did not host public testimony. A lot of these bills, as Amber is going to be talking about, you know, they were passed deep in the middle of the night out of these committees. The only House members that we could identify who voted against it were, you know, everybody from a lot of women voted against, women legislators voted against these bills. You know, you can see the names of the representatives who voted against those bills.
So House Bill 264 was the next bad bill. And this is a bill that would have created a new definition of commercial sexual exploitation to create inflated numbers of minor sex trafficking victims. Maxine, can you go to the next slide? So this is something that we see a lot, right? Where different agencies are using these really broad definitions, their own definitions of sex trafficking that include domestic violence and things that happen outside of the sex industry. And they're able to then, you know, say that they have served so many more sex trafficking victims, and they can use that to get funding, which is great for them. But then those numbers are also turned around and used to make really bad laws that impact the health and safety of sex trafficking victims and people in the sex industry. And then the other thing that happens, you know, is that those agencies who are used to serving sex trafficking victims, who are not people who have been actually trafficked in the sex industry, when they do have clients who, or people who need help who have been trafficked in the commercial sex industry, you know, they're often surprised and confused and don't really know how to help. But so the definition that would have been created in this bill which says that commercial sexual exploitation means the sexual abuse or exploitation of a child for the financial benefit of any person or in exchange for anything of value given or received by any person. And so this would have created a screening tool that would have been used across all of the agencies that deal with runaway children and homeless youth, and also OCS, to, you know, get baseline numbers of sex trafficking in Alaska. All of those agencies already have their own screening tools that they use, and they use the federal definition because most of them receive federal funding, which requires them to track those numbers using the federal definition anyways. But this definition includes like actual sex trafficking, and it would also include things like if there was a 17-year-old who lived with her 17-year-old boyfriend and they had sex, and she was receiving housing, or maybe she received a dinner or just anything of value from him. Next slide, please. And this is the kind of definition, the same kind of definition that was used a few years ago by Covenant House in the study that they participated in with Loyola University, which reported really inflated numbers of sex trafficking of minors and was used to promote really bad laws like House Bill 68, which we'll be talking about soon. And you can see they started off their question. This is the screening question that was used in their survey. They start off the question by saying sexual activity could mean dancing, stripping, posing for photos, or having any kind of sex, including oral sex. And then the question is, have you or anyone else ever received anything of value, such as money, a place to stay, food, drugs, gifts, or favors in exchange for your performing a sexual activity? So you can imagine there's a lot of people who have never exchanged sex for money or food or a place to stay, but who could answer yes to that question. Maybe they just know someone who has received flowers or a new car or housing from a romantic partner in relation to, you know, dancing or other sexual activity. So next slide, Maxine. So House Bill 264 passed the House Health and Social Services, and there was an amendment offered in that committee that would have changed the definition to more closely align with like the criminal definition of sex trafficking of minors, which requires there to be a sex trafficker. But that amendment failed, and then it went to House Finance. It passed House Finance, and then it went to the House floor, and it just kind of got stuck in this weird cycle of going back to the Rules Committee and never made it to a floor vote. And then next slide, Mike. Yeah. And
okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about that HB 265 that I had mentioned earlier, which we supported, and this was changing the wording of child pornography to sexual abuse of a minor. And that just changed it through Alaska's criminal statutes. And we supported this because it was more aligned to the crime, it was victim-centered, it just kind of really took it made more sense as opposed to sexual abuse of a minor materials and child pornography. I know it did become a part of HB66 in the omnibus crime bill, and that was a good part of that. Next slide. So this is a different bill, and this is not one that we supported at all. This speaks about HB 259, and this would have funded and made permanent the Governor's Sex Trafficking Council. So not to be confused with the Anchorage Sex Trafficking Task Force or the APD, FBI, the ABI, any sex trafficking task force. So this is a council that is made up of police, prosecutors, Department of Corrections, religious groups. They invited people from the lower 48 to talk about sex trafficking. It's heavily steered by people who profit from the criminalization of sex workers and sex trafficking victims, religious groups that might get funding and grants and money. So it's the members and the one report that they formulated gave incorrect information, very easily publicly debunked information that they could have kind of fact checked and chose not to. And there was probably about 9 times that myself and Tara attempted to go to these meetings, and in violation of the Alaska's Open Meetings Act, it did not admit us. We have been able to get in, I think I've been able to go twice. Tara might have been able to go 2 times or 3 times, but it was always a very difficult thing. We had to reach out to the ombudsman, and we never really got anything kind of figured out. Only after they were done with the report and things weren't really happening were we ever really allowed in. And one time we were allowed. Mm-hmm.
It was only after legislators talked to them, after we wrote so much about our experiences with them while we were opposing this bill.
Right, exactly. And even then, we weren't able to say anything except one time we were given a few minutes to talk. So we believe that an actual sex trafficking council should be run by sex trafficking survivors and people familiar with sex work and sex trafficking policy and related research. There's a term that we always say in sex work, it's like nothing about us without us. And if people wanted to actually hear what would increase safety for sex workers and increase safety for sex trafficking survivors, it would be necessary to speak to the people that it's actually trying to address. Next. So HB 259 did pass the House State of Affairs, but then it died in the House Finance, like many of Sarah Vance's other bills.
So, and then we had House Bill 67, which was a governor's bill. And there was a lot more to this bill, but this was the only part of the bill that had to do with us. And it requires people who are convicted of 1st or 2nd degree sex trafficking to register as sex offenders, which would make sense if the sex trafficking law was actually about sex trafficking, which the 1st degree sex trafficking statute, actually, most of it is about forcing people into prostitution or people who are in your custody or that kind of thing. So it makes sense that we do want people who are charged under most parts of the first degree sex trafficking statute to be registered sex offenders. But the second degree sex trafficking statute is really just made up of things that sex workers and sex trafficking survivors do for safety. And sex workers and sex trafficking survivors have both been convicted of sex trafficking in the second degree. We already know what happens in Alaska when sex trafficking victims are forced to register as sex offenders, because sex trafficking victims are charged federally with conspiracy to traffic in Alaska and are then forced to register as sex offenders. And that makes their address public on the sex offender registry so that their traffickers' associates, and even just other random traffickers who've heard of them have their address and can go to where they live and threaten them. And that's especially an issue, you know, when the trafficker oftentimes might have, you know, other state cases, other criminal cases where they're being charged with a crime and the victim is a victim or a witness in that case. And so they have a lot to gain in trying to not be convicted of more crimes by threatening their victims. So this was amended into House Bill 66 and it passed. And next one.
Yeah, so I get to talk about sex trafficking in the second degree because I was actually charged with this. So 10 years ago, you know, it was not a sex offender registrable offense, but now, because HB66 just passed, it is. And sex trafficking in the second degree has nothing about force, fraud, or coercion. So if we look at it, it's 11.66.20. So this is when a person commits the crime of sex trafficking in the second degree by managing, supervising, controlling, or own, either alone or in association with others, a prostitution enterprise. So a prostitution enterprise is when two or more sex workers are working together, two or more sex trafficking survivors are working together. This is about safety. This is about people being able to work together for their security. There's nothing about force, fraud, or coercion in here. This is also when someone procures or solicits a patron for a prostitute. So it could be like advertising, promoting, or facilitating travel in any way for commercial sexual conduct. And so, as we heard earlier, that means anything of value when someone is given or received from something. So this is now a sex offender registrable offense. So we have sex trafficking in the first degree, which has force, fraud, or coercion in the wording. And then we have this, which is just what people do to stay safe. Next.
So then we had House Bill 68. This was like a 60-page long bill. It took me like 6 hours to read it and to go back and read all of the statutes that it was changing and everything. So when we look at trafficking legislation, you know, there's a lot of legislation that they call anti-trafficking, but I call it pro-trafficking because it actually creates the conditions that allow sex trafficking to flourish. And we can really, like, looking back through Alaska history at the sex work policy and the sex trafficking, you know, when they closed down the houses in Spinard, there was like a huge spike in predatory trafficking. And when they closed down our websites, right, there was this huge spike. This is the kind of bill that creates more sex trafficking because it criminalizes sex trafficking survivors, it criminalizes their clients, and it criminalizes anyone who might witness the trafficking and be able to report it to the police. And traffickers know that, right? Traffickers use that to threaten their victims. They say to their victims, oh, you can't go to the police because that hotel room last week was in your name. So it would be super easy for them to convict you of sex trafficking. Or, you know, that rental car when you and another girl drove up to Fairbanks last week and worked. That rental car was in your name, so you offered that travel. It's, you know, sex trafficking in the second degree. You would have to register as a sex offender, and that stops victims from reporting to police. And then, I mean, especially when they see that other victims also are being charged, right? This is that kind of bad bill. So this bill would have created the crime of felony prostitution for sex workers and sex trafficking survivors, which would have been a Class B felony. And also for clients, it created the crime of felony prostitution for clients, which was only a Class C felony, because even the legislators who hate us, they hate the clients a little bit less. It did create the crime of felony patron of a victim of sex trafficking for clients who just solicit from a sex trafficking victim, not actually buy sex from them, but just solicit them. So this is part of House Bill 68 that was amended into House Bill 66 and passed. So House Bill 68 didn't pass, but this little part that I'm talking about now did pass as part of House Bill 66. So in House Bill 68, there was a definition of sex trafficking victim that made sense, right? But in the version that was passed in House Bill 66, there's no definition of sex trafficking victim. And since under the current sex trafficking law, most sex workers you could legally call us sex traffickers, and you could legally call us sex trafficking victims, because the law is so extremely broad. So potentially this could be used against any sex workers' clients. But, you know, when we're looking at trying to prevent sex trafficking, if a client were to solicit an appointment with a sex trafficking victim, and then they get there and they realize this woman is in trouble, she's in need of help, I want to call the police, he's already guilty of committing a Class B or a Class C felony for soliciting a victim of sex trafficking. And then next slide.
So Governor Dunleavy's House Bill 68, yeah, it was a very long, bad trafficking bill. As Tara said, it was this, you know, huge behemoth of a bill. You know, it created a mechanism for sex trafficking survivors with the very narrow definition of what that was, to get their prostitution convictions vacated if they could prove that they were a sex trafficking victim. So this law was written by the Department of Law on behalf of the governor's idea of sex trafficking. And so trying to sell this bad big bill, they tried to put this in to make it more palatable. And really what this does is that people with a sex trafficking or a prostitution conviction from, you know, 2000 or, you know, 1998 can go and say that they are a sex trafficking victim, and, you know, try to get their conviction sealed so that the public can't see it. And it's in everybody's best interest to get their records sealed that have prostitution convictions, because those prostitution convictions are used as means of discrimination. You know, if you're trying to get a job at Uber and they see a prostitution conviction on there, that, you know, a background check, that can be used to discriminate against you and not hire you. Or if you're trying to change housing situations, or if you have a child custody situation going on, you know, to have that prostitution conviction can really cause you a whole bunch of problems. The other thing this bill did is it made people not eligible to be get professional certifications if they had a sex trafficking conviction. So if me and somebody else are driving from Fairbanks to Anchorage to go to work, you know, we could be charged with sex trafficking each other in the second degree, as Amber described. And the Department of Law gave testimony in front of the House Judiciary Committee that yes, they would charge those cases. They would charge us with being sex traffickers. And so under the House Bill 68 that didn't pass, and this part did not make it in, it said that You could not be credentialed if you had this type of conviction, say to be a teacher, or if you're going to school to be a nurse, you could not be credentialed. And so this bill died in the House Finance Committee because the House Finance Committee was like, wait a minute, we let rapists and we let murderers be able to, get credentialed to work as doctors or anything else. So why are we being so extremely difficult for, people who could be convicted under the statute who are just common prostitutes? And so, that was part of why this bill died in the House Finance Committee. The other reason it died there is because of the fiscal notes. So fiscal notes are attached to all bills that go through a legislative process. And because this bill was a pill, this bill was so large, the House Finance Committee was like, how does the Department of Law only have 0 fiscal notes for making all these prosecutions? How does the Department of Corrections have 0 fiscal notes when people are going to be spending 10 years in prison for driving from Fairbanks to Anchorage to work? How is it that, all of these related departments who were going to be in charge of prosecuting these new definitions of crimes, these new high penalties of jail time and fees. How did they have 0 fiscal notes for these prosecutions? And then they had the nonprofit that provides all of the public defenders come on and give testimony. Oh yeah, this is going to be a big fiscal note for us. It's going to cost us a lot of money to defend these cases. And we don't even know how much it is. And you need to give us an additional investigator because people who are charged with these very large, mandatory 10-year prison sentence fight those charges tooth and nail. And so it's going to cost the public defenders, which are funded by the state of Alaska. It's going to cost them a lot of money. So the Alaska House Finance Committee was like, wait a minute, how is it that it's not going to cost to prosecute these crimes, but yet it's going to cost all this money to defend it? So that was one of the reasons why this whole bill ended up being killed, or it died in the House Finance, because really the Alaska State Legislature is very concerned about funding education. And so when you're trying to promote these bills that are saying they're trying to protect sex trafficking victims, but really what they do is they use up a bunch of public resources and you can't even fund your own education system, it just created a big conundrum for those legislators.
So there were some interesting things about House Bill 68. They would have moved the sex trafficking statutes. So right now they are in Chapter 66 of the Alaska statutes, which is the crimes against public decency, or the moral crimes section. It has things like prostitution and gambling, or, all of the things that we shouldn't be wasting state resources on. And it would have moved this trafficking statutes to the crimes against a person chapter, which is where, actual sex trafficking obviously belongs, but most of the sex trafficking statute really just, other than the trafficking in the first degree, applies to moral crimes like sex workers working together. But in the House Judiciary, we had some good legislators who worked really hard to remove all of the things that aren't sex trafficking from the sex trafficking statute in this bill. And they couldn't get them taken out of the bill, but instead they were moved to create a new crime of felony prostitution, which at least is more honest, right, than calling us sex traffickers. You're just being honest enough to admit that you hate prostitutes so much that you want them to go to jail for 10 years for Class B felonies for working together and trying to not get killed. But it also increased, you know, like having a place of prostitution right now is a Class C felony. It would have increased that to a Class B felony. And it created a new definition of induce that actually we proposed this definition back in the Sex Crimes Working Group of the Alaska Criminal Justice Commission back in the SB 91 days. I think most or maybe all of it was in the draft that we made back then. And that part actually did make it into House Bill 66 and passed. The next slide.
Oh, okay. So let's talk about Senator Matt Claman's omnibus crime bill, HB66. So this actually started out as a bad drug homicide bill that they were talking about last session before this one. And this would have made it a homicide, an unclassified felony, if you provided someone with drugs and they died. So that stops people from calling 911 when someone's ODing. We don't always have enough Narcan. I mean, I've been hearing a lot of people needing 3-4 doses of Narcan. And, you know, people aren't going to be able to call for help, and people are going to die because now people are going to be even more criminalized. ACLU was very outspoken about the unintended or intended consequences of this bill. You can decide for yourself what you think, but this definitely prioritizes criminalizing people, addicts, over saving drug users' lives. No money went towards prevention. It all went towards like criminalizing people. So as a floor or as a homicide bill, HB 66 made it through the House Judiciary, House Finance, House floor, and the only representatives who voted against it were Armstrong, Carrick, Eastman, Hanna, and Mina. So in the Senate Judiciary, though, Senator Claman turned it into a whole omnibus bill. So he put in a bunch of different pieces that we've been telling you about tonight. And he amended it into things, you know, like the HB 67 that had not made it through the House. Then on basis, which is just kind of like, I guess you could think of it as like a big whiteboard telling you, you know, when the committees are meeting and such. On a Thursday afternoon, it was released on there, and then it was passed out of the Senate Judiciary Committee without any public testimony or any opportunity for people to have any feedback. It went really quick, and that was on 2 a.m. on a Friday. So finally, Senate Finance took public testimony. There were many people that called in, many people that had written in. And so because of that, it reverted the bill back to its original version. I mean, it just kind of piecemealed it back. But the very next day, they amended it back into this omnibus bill again. And then it was passed on to the Senate floor, where it was passed on the very last day of session with 1 no vote. And then it was sent back to the House for concurrence. You know, we attempted at several points to get that bill amended, to remove the bad wording that would have fixed the sex trafficking statutes. I know that they did remove one thing that we were really trying to, and that was that 1 week notification that a sex offender had to give to leave state. And we found, you know, if they're going to be charging people with a class, you know, sex trafficking in the 2nd degree, if they're going to be charging sex workers and sex trafficking survivors, we needed that to be removed so people could leave the state when they were in trouble and when they needed to go to a safe house, as we have found with people that are sex trafficking survivors that have been charged with, you know, on the federal statute, and they have to sign up as a sex offender. We've had to have people leave the state immediately because they are in peril. They need a safe place to go. So we were able to get them to remove that requirement, thankfully. Yeah, let's see. The no votes on the House floor when it came back to the House were, it looks like Armstrong, Carrick, Eastman, Hanna, and Mina. And the only person on the Senate floor that voted no at any point was Tobin.
So in its final version, House Bill 66 made sex trafficking in the 1st and 2nd degree a registry sex offenses, so that sex workers and trafficking victims who are convicted of you know, like traveling together to Fairbanks or doing duos will have to register as sex offenders. Currently, we know of just 2 sex workers and 1 sex trafficking survivor who have been convicted of sex trafficking in the 2nd degree, but it's, you know, more often sex trafficking victims who are working together like on a daily basis, and are more vulnerable to being charged under these laws rather than sex workers, because we have the choice to be like, oh, I don't want to be charged with that crime. I can just go get my own hotel room. Whereas trafficking victims, you know, have to share hotel rooms and work together to save money for their traffickers. It created the crime of felony patronizing a victim of sex trafficking for just soliciting somebody with reckless disregard that they could be a victim. It created a new definition of induce in the sex trafficking statute, which is mostly good. There's one little part of it that I think could be misused, but 90% of it is good. It creates a new definition of commercial sexual activity in regards to the sex trafficking law that seems to include strip clubs. And it created a new definition of human trafficking in the 2nd degree that might also target strip clubs. And we'll talk about the strip club thing again in a minute. Next slide.
So the other things that House Bill 66 did is it created the crime of assault in a presence of a child, a Class A misdemeanor. So that was another small bill that was amended into this huge crime omnibus bill. It criminalizes the possession of elements that would make methamphetamines, including 9 grams or more of cold or allergy medication, a serious felony. It changed, you know, the child pornography definition to child sexual abuse materials. So that was, you know, from another bill that we talked about earlier. It allows police to testify on our behalf of victims or witnesses in grand jury. So this is a big problematic piece. You know, what this basically did is it weakened the grand jury process to allow hearsay by police officers. So the police officers could come in on behalf of a victim and give testimony. So all of the rape crisis centers, the domestic violence shelters really wanted this piece in because they have so much difficulty getting victims to follow through with giving testimony in front of grand jury in order to indict people for the crimes of domestic violence or sexual assault. But the problem is for the sex worker nation is that police are allowed to have sex with us in the process of investigating prostitution or investigating sex trafficking. So that sexual conduct is legal in Alaska, right? So they can have sexual contact with us, and then they can arrest us for prostitution, arrest us for sex trafficking, and turn around and give grand jury testimony or testimony against us in the grand jury setting, because those rules have been weakened. So there's just a lot of conflict of interest with this provision, but it was part of the main provision that Senator Matt Claman wanted to help sell it to the victim community, to be able to support this bad bill and kind of ignore the fact that reclassifying prostitution offenses as sex trafficking and now be registerable sex offenses, you know, is going to create more victims out of us. But maybe they like that, you know, they just want to see more victims. I don't know. This big bad bill, it also made murder in the 2nd degree an unclassified felony. That means, you know, 20 years in jail. And that's if you give drugs to someone who dies. But this could be reduced to a Class A felony if they sought medical attention for a person who overdoses. You know, you remain at the scene with somebody who's in an overdose state, you cooperate with police if the police show up. And it was a small amount of drugs, but still, because it's a Class A felony, it's going to really disincentivize people from calling the police if their friend is overdosing, if they think that they're going to be held responsible for those drugs. And the other really bad thing about this bill is it requires involuntary commitment for people not competent to stand trial. So there were a whole bunch of other groups like the ACLU of Alaska that came out against this bad bill because it violates a bunch of civil liberties on a broad basis, and it's going to end up once again being challenged in court, with the state saying, oh no, there's a zero fiscal notes. No, it's going to cost the state money to have it challenged in court. The state is going to have to defend it in court, and that's going to cost the state money. And as long as the state is having to pay out all this money to defend these bad bills in court, that is money out of the children of Alaska's pockets. That's out of their education system, which is already under federal, it's not federal prosecution, but they're in violation of a bunch of federal laws because, they can't keep the snow off the roofs and the maintenance to be able to maintain these schools properly as they're supposed to. It's constitutionally required and mandated that they do so. So, passing these bad criminal bills has negative impact on, the public safety and the public education of Alaska.
Can I say real quick, that unclassified felony, that is a sentence of 30 to 99 years.
Thanks for that. Yeah, we're going to get to some question and answers. You guys can go ahead and, put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand at the end. We're almost there.
So we're just going to look really quickly at the part that might affect strip clubs, right? So Section 26 of House Bill 66 says, creates this new definition of a commercial sex act, which means a sexual act for which anything of value is given or received by any person. But a sexual act means sexual penetration or sexual contact. So this is different than the definition of, so we have sexual penetration and sexual contact are terms that are used all throughout the sexual assault statutes. In the prostitution statute, we have the term sexual conduct, which includes things like hand jobs as well as sexual penetration, but does not include lap dances. Next slide, Maxine. Sorry, I forgot it wasn't on my screen. So here's the definition of sexual contact. And it says that it means knowingly touching directly or through clothing the victim's genitals, anus, or female breast, or causing the victim to touch directly or indirectly through clothing the victim's or defendant's or victim's genitals, anus, or breast. So this is definitely a lap dance, right? Includes that kind of sexual contact, and also, involves receiving something of value, money. And have you guys noticed the price of a lap dance has not gone up in like 40 years now? It's ridiculous. But anyways, and then if we look over here at the next image, is Section 16 of House Bill 66, which gives the new trafficking in the second degree statute. And you see down there towards the bottom, it says offers, sells, advertises, promotes, or facilitates travel that includes a commercial sex act. So a lot of people travel to Alaska to dance in the summer, and they probably call up the strip club first. I used to travel and work in the lower 48 in the winter, and I would come back to Alaska every summer, and I would work at Good Time Charlie's on the Kenai Peninsula, and where all the rich tourist fishermen were. But before I would travel to another state to dance, I would call up the strip club and be like, hey, can I work there? What's the dress code? What's the house fees? All that kind of stuff, right? So now, that could be considered promoting or facilitating travel that includes a commercial sex act. And then it also says, inducing or causing another person to engage in a commercial sex act. And part of that definition of inducing includes providing somebody with a controlled substance, which I know that very often when I've gone and auditioned at a strip club, I get a free drink, usually when I'm talking to the manager. about the, being hired and the rules and everything. So under those two parts, it seems like strip clubs would be guilty of sex trafficking in the second degree. And then if we go to the next slide, we also have this term of a commercial sexual act in the patron of a victim of trafficking statute. It says a person commits the crime of patron of a victim of sex trafficking if they solicit a commercial sexual act. So that would include a lap dance, right? So if they solicit a commercial sexual act with reckless disregard that the person engaged in the sexual act is a victim of trafficking. What is a victim of trafficking? Perhaps it's undefined in this bill, but it could be somebody who was induced to travel to Alaska to engage in lap dances or commercial sex acts, right? So potentially a lot of people could be charged under this section of code. And we're almost to the end.
Right. So getting involved in the legislative process, it's making your voice heard. It's not as overwhelming as it might sound from all of this. So if you follow groups like CUS, Planned Parenthood, Native Movement on social media, and then subscribe to newsletters, then you're able to understand, take the time to become familiar with issues before legislative session starts. Because so many of these bills move fast and there's never enough time for notification, right? So if you do get an email from one of these groups, asking you to sign a petition, go ahead and read through that and send that email or call in and testify. And always, there's a really powerful way to always start and end your public testimony is by telling the legislators clearly how you're asking them to vote on the bill.
So thanks so much for taking the time to learn about sex work issues in the legislative session in Alaska for 2024. To learn more, sign up for our newsletter at our website. You have our website there. We have a Facebook group. Amber, has like great social media. She's got her blog, she has TikTok. We're on Twitter. That's a great way to reach out. But we really rely on your support, trying to get to Juneau this coming session so we can stay there. That costs money to be able to, get a place and stay there. And, it's a lot of effort to be able to do that for the 120 days. And we just really need a lot of support to be able to do that. I think if we had been able to do that this year, we might have been able to stop this bad bill. We were able to stop, all these bad bills mostly, except for the House Bill 66. But it's just, we know it takes a lot of education. We have our educational series that's coming up that's starting on June, I think is it 18th?
Yeah.
We've got our flyer there. It's got a different Zoom link, but the same Zoom link for the June series, for the July series, and the August one. We're going to be talking about actual sex trafficking cases in Alaska so we can really see what's going on. We're going to talk about the lies. There's a lot of these old lies that are drug out by legislators that have been roundly dismissed in the public sphere, for decades, but we see them recycled and used over and over again. So it's good to familiarize yourself with the lies, so at least you can spot them, right? And you can just stand up and be a voice that just says, no, that is a lie. That is just so helpful for us to have members of the public and our allies to be able to help call out those lies. So we can go and take some questions, and I'm going to stop recording now for the question part. So let me do that. I'm going to leave the sharing on, but I'm going to stop recording.
Yeah, and if you have a question, go ahead and just unmute yourself and feel free to ask. Don't worry. There's no dumb question. Every question is valid. Bella?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. This was really, really informative. I feel so bad for you. Y'all are fucked. But anyway, so when you were saying that they have to, if they can prove they're a victim, they get it vacated. I like how on one hand, everyone's a victim, but now you got to prove you're a victim. So in Rhode Island, they put it that if you claimed you were a victim, they couldn't prosecute you. And it still didn't work because they arrest you and you end up on the news. And I get if you have a common name, someone might not figure out you're on Google if it's an employer. But with Google, getting something expunged or vacating means very little anymore. But just the fact, and that's the one thing we couldn't get the study commission to agree on. Can we just not arrest the victim?